So this program today will discuss the evolving role and growing role of photography and media in exposing government crackdowns, tragedies, and war crimes in real time. Before I introduce our great panel, we would like to have a moment of silence for Ben Ferenz. He died on April 7th, 2023 at the age of 103. He was one of the investigators of Nazi war crimes at the Nuremberg trials and was an advocate for the creation of the International Criminal Courts. If you all please join me in a moment of silence in remembrance of him. Thank you. So joining us on stage today is Gary Knight. He is the CEO of the Seven Foundation and co-founder of the Seven Photo Agency. Knight was a photojournalist between 1988 and 2017 and a former Newsweek magazine photographer who covered the wars in Cambodia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, among others. We are also joined by Dalila Mujagic. She leads the international justice and accountability work at the global nonprofit organization Witness. She also teaches law and evidence at the Global Campus for Human Rights. Her current work is dedicated to training and advising lawyers, prosecutors, and civil society organizations who seek to use visual documentation to prove atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar. We're also joined by Zaid Rad Al-Hussein, who is a professor of practice and of law and human rights at the University of Pennsylvania. He served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2014 to 2018. He is currently president and CEO of the International Peace Institute. In 2019, he was appointed as a member of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders working for peace, justice, and human rights founded by Nelson Mandela. And our moderator for today is Biz Herman. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the Borders and Boundaries Project here at Prairie World House. Her research examines how experiencing violence in the context of conflict and forced migration shapes social cohesion and prospects for sustainable peace. In addition to her academic work, she is an Emmy-nominated visual journalist. So at this time, I'll welcome them all to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm thrilled to be here today with this wonderful panel. And thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. Just to begin and contextualize what we're going to be talking about today, from the Nuremberg trials to the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s to the ongoing war in Ukraine, visual media have exposed apparent war crimes and severe human rights abuses. Photography and video can show how, when, and where atrocities took place, forcing acknowledgement of what happened and perhaps increasing the chances that perpetrators will be brought to justice. Today, we'll cover some of the innovations and challenges related to the practice, ethics, opportunities, and challenges using visuals as evidence. Each of our panelists' various areas of expertise overlap and dovetail quite brilliantly, and I'm so grateful to be able to learn from all of you today. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start with one question that I'm going to pose sort of as a broad opening to our conversation, and then we'll continue our conversation for the next 30 minutes or so, and then take questions from all of you. So please note if you have any questions, because we'll be taking them at the end. So we'll just go down the line. What do each of you think is the biggest challenge regarding using visuals to document and communicate current events and abuses? This can be in the context of journalism, of open source investigations, or of formal judicial processes. And as a bonus, if you want to define some kind of concept that's commonly used in your work so that we can all be sort of situated on the same page here, that'd be incredibly helpful. So Dalila, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So I think right now the biggest challenge is that those who have the harshest burden placed on them are those who are documenting acts of human rights abuse and human rights crimes well before formal investigators and processes can make it onto the scene. And that burden is getting larger and larger every single day, every single year. And it dovetails with this lack of trust and a renewed questioning of what is truth. Are we living in a post-truth society? Can we trust our eyes? Is seeing not believing anymore? And that, of course, puts at risk all of the efforts, all of the time, and even personal safety that those on the front lines of conflict especially undertake to capture and preserve, then keep alive documentation until a formal judicial process can take place. So I'm thinking about them. I'm thinking about community practitioners, community documenters, and how we can better support them. So the term I would like to define for everyone is community-based practitioner, as an antithesis almost to the idea that expertise only exists in the global north and in professionalized spaces.
Thanks, Biz. It's hard to know where to start really to answer that question, because you know, as practitioners on the ground, we're dealing with a number of things. Trust is a key one. And there it's the public, the trust that the public have or don't have in what they're being shown. AI, of course, is a massive problem for us. There are some technological advances we can discuss a little bit later that might help ameliorate that, but that's a big one. So the public not believing what they see. Another huge problem for us are resources. So the press, who we would ordinarily go to support these kinds of stories, no longer have the economic resources to support a lot of investigations. So that's a very big issue. You know, back in the 1990s in Kosovo, I was on assignment for 2 months, along with 4 other photographers for Newsweek. The idea that that would happen now beyond, you know, AP, Reuters, the New York Times is just not, it's not possible. And then access to the story. Nobody's ever wanted anyone to, you know, no perpetrator has ever wanted their crimes to be photographed. But now governments, militaries are obviously hyper aware of the power of imagery, and they can see what you're doing minute by minute. So it's becoming incredibly difficult to get access. And Ukraine, which is photographed, if you look at Ukraine, for example, there's an enormous amount of censorship. Obviously on the Russian side, there's virtually no photography. And even on the Ukrainian side, the access to the story is very, very limited by the government and by the military. So I'd say those are the key things for us.
So I can only sort of underscore what both Dalila and Gary have already said. It's key to understand that we're looking at 2 dimensions of this. One is the trigger that public opinion can give to then judicial processes, and then how the evidence collected is curated or not, depending on the circumstances within the context of judicial processes that happen at the time. And we'll get into this in greater detail, but the basic international standards required of any judicial proceeding, especially when you're looking at international crimes, i.e. crimes of interest to the international community, that must be met. And the presumption of innocence is one. And you have to be extremely careful that when courting public opinion, to serve as the trigger for something deeper, a sort of a judicial accounting for the crimes committed, you're also not sort of unwittingly poisoning the very processes that you yourself demand that need and ought to take place, such that justice can be served to both the perpetrator, but also to the victims and the survivors of the atrocities committed.
These are all great points and great launching points that we'll touch upon in greater detail throughout the conversation. But to sort of start at the very basic Gary, if I can ask you sort of throughout the course of your career, can you speak to the unique power of visuals? Why do visuals command attention and sort of shift public opinion in a way that perhaps words cannot?
Yeah, I think a photograph, a visual image, as opposed to sort of time-based media, but a still photograph, it elicits an instant response, right? So in the old days, you look at it on a newspaper, these days online, on your phone, but it's an instantaneous response. It demands an instantaneous response. I think photographs, it's often spoken of as sort of being a universal language. I'm not sure if that's quite true, but photographs don't need translation. They need context, but they don't need translation. So you can see a photograph of a girl who's, you know, running from napalm, running down a road in Vietnam, and you understand instantly what you're looking at. So I think it's a very powerful introduction to a story, a crime. I think also photographs can exist in multiple spaces. So they can exist in the media in the short term. You can see something that happened that day or the following day or the day before. But they can also be seen in cultural spaces, in museums. They can be seen in books. They have a sort of a different kind of shelf life very often, a different existence. And I think also, you know, they're very emotional objects, photographs. And for many of us, if you're looking at a photograph of a family, you know, trying to flee from something, you might relate to an experience that you've had, or an anxiety or a fear that you might have, or an experience that somebody in your family might have. So they're very emotional.
And Dalila, you use visuals in your work quite often, and in training people in conducting open source investigations. So I was wondering if you could sort of contextualize, what is an open source investigation? What is the role of visuals in being used in such investigations? And what are some of the important ethical considerations in those practices?
Sure thing. So open source investigations are investigations, in our case, relating to human rights abuses that are largely or in whole done by gathering information from open sources. And in these days, that mostly means gathering videos, photos, and text-based data from the internet. And again, these days, the internet tends to involve and have a heavy emphasis on social media sites, simply because this is where user-generated content is most often put up and is findable. So there are aspects to open source investigations, which is also known as OSINT, originally standing for open source intelligence, that focus on not only the collection of the gathering of such information and visuals, but then also trying to understand, what does this actually tell us? So how do we verify? So it's about browsing, finding, as well as then verifying and authenticating such information so that said information can be turned into evidence. And I would say the types of visuals that are these days mostly involved with human rights abuses are live action videos shot by eyewitnesses to human rights abuses, to crimes, to conflicts. And a lot of them are unwitting or unwilling participants in something that is happening in their community, in their house, in their lives. So I often say one of the reasons that I train and work with my organization Witness is so that anyone can know how to capture important information that eventually may make it to the internet, including the housewife who, you know, in her fairly stable life suddenly finds a missile hanging out of her living room ceiling, such as our friends and colleagues did and are now seeing in Ukraine.
And Zaid, you have a fascinating lens on this conversation, having been very involved in the establishment and operation of the International Criminal Court. And so I was wondering if you could speak to sort of how in the procedures of international justice, what do you see as a similar question that I posed to Gary? What are the unique powers and challenges of using visuals as evidence in crimes?
So I mentioned, I think you mentioned Nuremberg at the beginning of the presentation. It's worth just spending a few minutes and going back to the testimony. Not so much the testimony, but the effect that the showing of the Nazi concentration camp film had on the 29th of November, 1945, 9 days after the trial began. And the defendants were all feeling quite confident that they could somehow argue their way out of the charges. And Gustav Gilbert was the psychiatrist assigned to the US delegation, or the US prosecutorial delegation. And in 1948, he published his diary of those events because he was with the prisoners. And if you'll allow me just to read excerpts from that afternoon. So it starts off the afternoon session, and Gilbert writes, Goering, Ribbentrop, and Hess had a great laugh over the reading of Goering's telephone conversation with Ribbentrop on the day of Hitler's triumphant entry into Vienna, describing the whole thing as a lark with birds twittering, etc. Then the hilarity in the dock suddenly stopped as Commander Donovan announced the showing of a documentary film on Nazi concentration camps as they were found by American troops. Fritsch already looks pale. So basically what Gilbert then does, every minute to 2 minutes, he jots down the reactions of the defendants to the film. And he says, Fritsch already looks pale and sits aghast as it starts with scenes of prisoners burnt alive in a barn. Keitel wipes brow, takes off headphones. Hess glares at screen, looking like a ghoul with sunken eyes over the footlamp. Keitel puts on headphone, glares at screen out of the corner of his eye. Von Neurath has head bowed, doesn't look. Funk covers his eyes, looks away as if in agony, shakes his head. Streicher keeps watching, immobile except for an occasional squint. Funk, now in tears, blows nose, wipes eyes, looks down. Frick shakes head as an illustration of violent death. Frank mutters, horrible. Later in the day, Gilbert went and sat with all of the defendants. And he writes, Funk was depressed and burst into tears as soon as we asked him how he was affected by the film. Horrible, horrible, he repeated in a choking voice. When asked whether he would need a sleeping pill, he sobbed, what's the use? What's the use? Walter Cronkite, who was covering the trial, subsequently wrote that the film itself almost certainly guaranteed the death sentence for many, if not most, of the defendants. And this was only 9 days into the trial. So powerful was it at a time when visual evidence was still in its infancy in terms of it being considered as part of the trial proceeding. It was so potent and so powerful that it almost from that point on marked a change in the way that the trial was conducted. But it wasn't without controversy, and I don't know whether you'd want me to delve into it, because in common law, there is a tradition that hearsay is not accepted as part of the evidentiary record. The film itself had a narrator, and the footage was not sequenced chronologically. And it was shown only once with the wrong sequence and a narrator. And so it was considered to be prejudicial in some quarters that already there had been such an attempt under this, in terms of drafting the statute, that this needed to be seen as a fair trial, that the Allies were not going to be, putting on a show trial of the sort that Stalin was all too familiar, that this was going to be a fair trial, and perhaps the film did damage. The overwhelming opinion was that it did not, that it was a recognition that under the statute, hearsay evidence was permissible. And ultimately, it led to the refinement in the way that courts then dealt with visual evidence. But the potency of it was underscored at that moment.
So Gary and Dalila, this is both for both of you. If you could talk a little bit about the ways in which you've thought of the work that you've created, the work that you created, Gary, as a photojournalist, and Dalila, the work that you're creating collaboratively with the people that you're working with on open source investigations. What are some of the sort of like processes and thoughts that go through your mind in terms of thinking of the multiple uses of the visual evidence that you're gathering? So how might, considering how such evidence might eventually be used in a court of law be come into your mind, or how might it affect the sort of way you go about documenting things in the field?
Sure. So if I take, for example, the work that I produced, I photographed war crimes in Kosovo in 1999. Some being committed, some after they had been committed. And I was on an assignment for Newsweek magazine. So I was very aware that I had an obligation to the client I worked for to produce something that they could use, in this case, sort of several weeks into the conflict. I wasn't producing news daily or weekly even, but I needed to produce something that they could use, and I needed to work in collaboration with their writers. So there's a sort of certain intent there, right? So I have to create a narrative story, a narrative arc. I also, with that story, I wasn't sure how to approach that story until the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, produced an indictment. And I downloaded the indictment, read the indictment, and understood that I could illustrate that indictment. So I could illustrate persecution, deportation, and murder, the three areas that the indictment covered. So, and I thought, well, I want to produce evidence, and I'm going to illustrate as best I can as a photographer this indictment. So that had something longer term in mind. And I knew that I wanted to produce something irrefutable, having witnessed crimes against humanity and war crimes in Bosnia from 92, when I first started working there, and all the way through to Kosovo in 99. I was determined to do something that would produce evidence, the kind of work that filmmakers and photographers produced in the concentration camps in 45, something that would hold Milosevic to account forever, right? So I had that in mind, and then I understood how I wanted it to look. I understood that at the time. I knew I wanted to produce a book and an exhibition to show the work in a different context. So yeah, all of these things were going through my mind whilst I was producing the work. So it's, it's a lot to juggle, but it's possible. Long answer, very sorry.
And speaking of the former, the ICTY for the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, I am a survivor of that war. And I remember thinking when I was younger, and still I do think at times, what does justice mean? What did that court do? What was the impact of the decisions of that court and the evidence presented at that court to me and to my lovely 70 plus collection neighbors who lived in the village with me. And I want to not scare you by saying not much, in the sense that our lived realities, our day-to-day lives, our remembrance and narratives of war, and the power of who gets to tell that story, who gets to preserve that story outside of the courtroom, even before the courtroom starts to act, is in the hands of so many different actors who all and ought to work in tandem with the communities facing these abuses. And I want to relate that to a word that Zaid mentioned earlier, which is the curation. And so here, when we think about, it's not just about getting the right information together, but now, these days, for example, with the Syrian conflict, of which there are more minutes filmed of the Syrian conflict than there are minutes of the conflict itself. When we have mass amounts of video uploaded to YouTube and everywhere else, how do you make sense of that to a court, let's say, for example, who does not have 30 years to just keep reviewing visuals, right? So that is an act of curation, and it's a deliberate act, it's an intentional act, but it's also an act that calls into question power, privilege, access, and expertise. And so with our work and what we do, one of the points of training people on how to, again, film, collect, gather, verify, authenticate the sort of the stages of from capture to courtroom of visual evidence is how do we find the right people to work with and to be included within these steps? Because of course we have experts like my esteemed colleagues up here who are involved in these processes, but we are not the only ones who get a say and who ought to be involved. And I think this is one of the gets into the ethical questions of using open source and working with open source information, which is, again, who is involved. And the final note, I know this is a long answer, but final note is that, again, with open source, it is a myth that open source means distant, means only online, because so many practitioners, I think, fall into the trap of being not connected to the communities on the ground simply because you are not on the ground with them. And I'll leave it at that, but to say it's a question that requires more thinking and more interrogation of our own practices.
Zaid, I was wondering if you could provide an example of a case, in addition to a more recent case in which visuals have been used in formal judicial processes, and sort of maybe if you could speak a little bit to how such processes have evolved over time as technology has changed, as sort of knowledge of technology has shifted. Have the sort of judicial processes for accounting for these things and allowing them as evidence shifted, as you touched upon before?
So this is so interesting listening to others. Various thoughts have crept into my little brain, but one obviously in this country recalls the powerful effect the visual evidence of the killing of George Floyd had in terms of the trial, the proceeding, the way that the jury understood the crime. One also needs to think that given the fact that so many of us could be potential witnesses to crimes, and in certain contexts, extreme crimes, if they were funneled into a judicial process, one has to then also think that that judicial process needs to guarantee our safety. That is their way of identifying who the photographer was. And if that photographer were not necessarily a photojournalist with a media company behind them, but an individual who was just stringing or someone who happened to be there, witness protection is extremely expensive and difficult. And I have to be frank with you, we're not doing it well. We're not doing it well. You have to be a very brave person in certain contexts to record the visual evidence because harm could be done to you. Even if you put it out there and try and disguise it, it can be still, you could still be identifiable. So we need to think very carefully of that side. The other thing is that it, of course, fits into a broader process in the sense that you have to, there's no point in having this incredibly powerful visual imagery in a trial that's flawed in so many different directions, where the basic international human rights standards, or let's say the fair trial standards as laid out by this particular treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in Article 14, lays out everything that's required of a fair trial. If that isn't obtained, then all this evidence that could be used is for naught. And similarly, there's so many procedural hurdles one needs to meet that if you're not meeting them, then the evidence could end up falling on stony ground. And so it all has to be part of a chain that's really well worked out. Fortunately, we are seeing this. I mean, you go back to the Popovich trial at the International Criminal Tribunal, former Yugoslavia, in 2006. There was visual evidence, film and still photography used, but unlike Nuremberg, it didn't come in one gush with a narrator. It was worked into the individual testimonies provided by eyewitnesses who were taking the stand, and it was blended in, and often without a commentary, without a narration. And so the courts have started to become really adept in how best to use it, but still with the profusion of what, this is what Dalila was talking about, one still has to somehow guarantee the anonymity of those who want that anonymity and defense guaranteed, lest they be intimidated, or worse, as we've seen in some trials, physically harmed. So we I think need to balance it out. The power that is afforded and offered by people like Gary and actually Dalila's organization, which is tremendous, must also be met by a due diligence and care that the witnesses and those offering this are protected.
So I think that also touches on the point more broadly of how trust plays into this conversation and the role of trust in evidence and trust in visuals. And so, Gary, we talked the other day about a report published by Gallup and the Knight Foundation, which surveyed Americans about their views of the news media and found that 53% of the populace has unfavorable views as compared to 26% that has favorable views, so twice as many. And so this has been a long-standing trend. It's been declining. Trust in the news media and also in institutions more broadly in the US have been declining. So how has this affected your work? How do you see this going hand in hand with media literacy? And what do you think that means for sort of like visual documentation moving forward?
Yeah. So, well, Finland, I think, is the most media literate country on earth, and it also has the most trust in its own media. So those two things go hand in hand. So I think media literacy is critical. I think trust in the media is critical. It's where most of us get our sort of information about what's going on in the world. And the media can occasionally undermine itself, but it's principally undermined by political forces. And that's very clear here in the United States. It's clear in Europe. It's clear in the United Kingdom, where I come from, Hungary, etc. So we have to. Our obligation is to fight back. So we have to make sure that the work that we produce is fair and accurate and withstands scrutiny. That's the first point of departure. And also, we've learned at my organization to build our own relationship with the public and use different methods to communicate with the public. Some of that is social media, unfortunately, but I'm not convinced that's the most effective way. But we now put a lot of our work into museums, into public institutions, recontextualize it. And we had an exhibition that looked at post-conflict societies in Sarajevo recently. I think 26,000 people came to visit that. So we have learned to not rely, actually, as practitioners, we've learned not to rely on the press as our sole place of articulation.
And I'm going to pose one more question to Dalila and then open it up to everybody else. So please start getting your questions ready. But Dalila, for you, I mean, a significant part of your training is about, procedures and ethics and tools and processes, but also it is about, at its core, media literacy in some ways. So how do you see media literacy relating to your work in open source investigations, both for those that are being trained to collect evidence as part of investigations, but then also in sharing the results of investigations with the public?
One thing about media literacy, and especially in relation to this challenge we have all identified, which is this lacking public faith, public trust in visual documentation and what is shown to them online and in the media they consume, is again with the power and rise of AI, automatically generated imagery. This idea of synthetic media being so sophisticated that human eyes may not be able to detect the difference between a synthetic and an authentic or originally captured piece of video is that it's related to this idea that then how much farther do we have to go to prove that something that is real is actually real? And this relates to the original my opening statement that I said on, again, this increasing burden on those who document, to have to over and over again say and be able to prove to various depths why what they shot was real and how. And this is especially related to the over interviewing of sources of people who document. This is related to the sort of also, in a way, over reliance on technology. But we now live in a world where, especially, for example, with synthetic media, we get in those who create synthetic media and those who research it and find ways to detect it are in a constant cat and mouse game. So every time there's progress in detection, there's another leap in more sophistication. So so this is why we also teach that technology is not a magic wand. I also teach that video is not a magic wand. As Gary mentioned, we can use video to prove specific elements of crimes that can eventually be used in court, but it does not stand alone. And again, we say evidence is a puzzle that relies on multiple different sources. So we have to keep reminding ourselves of that.
Yes, I want to add something. There is a new technological initiative that we're playing with at the moment with Adobe. It's called CAI, Content Authenticity Initiative. So a number of camera companies have agreed to now incorporate this new technology into cameras. So when an image is captured, it has some software embedded in it which cannot be removed. So when the photograph is then published, that's, for example, say in the New York Times or on AP, you, the audience, can click on the image and you can see absolutely everything that has happened to that image, including the addition of metadata, caption information, for example, and every way the image has been cropped, toned, and changed. So that won't work for people posting things on Instagram, but if you're going to Legacy Press, for example, or somewhere like the Seven Foundation, you will be able to click on the image and see how it has evolved since it was first captured. So there's a transparency there.
Yeah, no, it's just picking up from where Gary left off. When I was running the Human Rights Office for the UN, I arrived in 2014, soon after a discussion emerged between the UN and the Sri Lankan government over the authenticity of footage that was shown in a British documentary about the fire zones that were in place or no fire zones that were in place in 2008, 2009, when the Sri Lankan army was attacking the Tamil strongholds, and these fire zones were set up and then were subsequently bombarded. But the Sri Lankan government, the Rajapaksa government, contended that the footage was fake. It had been doctored and tampered with. And so we approached a number of different companies to actually authenticate that the footage was real, including an execution scene. And that formed the basis of the UN's discussion then with the government. And then the government sort of changed. But I think this idea that Gary was focusing on, that you actually concentrate the technical skills in one organization that can do this, will be of great benefit, either to the UN or to subsequent investigations, criminal investigations designed to uphold the responsibility of the international community to see justice being done.
If I can pick back up really quickly from that, which is we're also seeing this convergence of what media literacy means, which is increasingly including and inclusive of tech literacy. But we have to remember that, and what Zaid just mentioned, which is what we call the liar's dividend. So there are governments and actors and others out there who understand that there is a perhaps lack of trust in what is seen because it could be fake, it could be miscontextualized, and this is again what we call the liar's dividend. And they use it to political effect, to also bring down the voices of those who bore witness. And something that we have to remember then here is we also get sometimes too technical about things. And if it becomes all about the metadata and less about who was there and who saw and who can tell the story, this is where we get a failure of media literacy, both with the public, but then it also reaching into the judicial system. So there's this, I always say media literacy starts everywhere and nowhere at once, because it's, I think when we have as a public, a culture of media literacy, of prioritizing media literacy, the tech literacy and the understanding that comes afterwards flows a bit easier and a bit better.
That's a great point. Any questions from the audience? We have, you can come up to our mic over there if you'd like to. And there's some great, go ahead. Oh, I mean, you could project, if you use the mic, then everyone online can hear you as well. And we have some great questions from online, but if people want to start lining up over there.
Robert Jackson, Nuremberg prosecutor, was worried that the atrocities and the mass killings would not stop with Germany. Since then, our nation has slaughtered 6 million or so Southeast Asians in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and more recently, about 1 million Muslims. And there's photographs of both these. You've seen, I hope, the photographs of Muslim children who have been drone killed. So where's the accountability of this? And why aren't we discussing that?
No, I think the point is well taken. It's not for lack of any desire to see that justice be done. It's a matter of legal jurisdiction. Who has jurisdiction over these particular events? And then is there pressure being exercised on the powers that be to ensure that there would be some further penalty upon sort of, if there's a conviction being brought for the alleged crimes that have been committed. I mean, for example, when the Feinstein report emerged about and focused on the policy of rendition by the US, of course, would like to think that it doesn't commit or perpetrate any torture, but the US and some 47 other countries, including my own, were very much basically identified as countries that did practice torture, no matter how it was defined. And then it's incumbent upon people in those countries pressing their governments to say that this is not acceptable, that we want to see investigations and then convictions, or prosecutions and convictions, if the evidence is there, of people who've been involved in these atrocities. So that it's not that we're not aware. I think the evidence in many cases is there. It's a question of whether you can muster political will or the will of people to put pressure on their governments to see justice done. And I think that many are sympathetic. And I can tell you, I think all of us have been everyone on the stage has been in a war. No one who comes out of a war isn't idealistic. Anyone who's really seen it comes out of it who isn't idealistic, who doesn't feel that there's so much excessive violence and horrendous violence, despicable violence, that must be accounted for. It doesn't mean that you can't fight, you can fight a purely antiseptic or clean war. You're going to have casualties, but there's so much excess that is totally beyond what is acceptable. And I think for all of us who've experienced something like that, we understand it. So we're very sympathetic, I think, with the point that you've raised.
Okay,
But
so
not just for the US, for many countries who also ought to be doing the right thing.
Sorry, we want to make sure that we get to, that was a really.
okay, I
thank
was
you for
just
your
wondering,
question.
where's the outrage by the citizenry? Are we even aware of what I just said, and including academia?
I think,
Ivy
let me,
League.
that's a great, well, everyone, that's something that we'll touch upon at the very end as well, I promise. But thank you for your question.
Okay, two things that I heard. One is the concept of witness protection and being involved with the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. I understand the difficulty, as well as part of it is also funding, getting the right amount of money that's needed to protect the witnesses. So that's a biggie in terms of international, and maybe we even have to look into our own country. The other is, I remember sitting in on an ICTY trial. It was a trial of generals. I don't recall the names. And I thought all the people sitting around me, that when they were declared innocent, would be, you know, they figured I expected them to be declared guilty. And all of a sudden they were declared innocent with tremendous applause from all those sitting around me. And I was shocked. So what happened is, in this particular village, there were two ways of thinking about it. Some felt that those generals were responsible for liberating the village. Others, of course, the village was destroyed by the work of, or under the direction of the generals. How do you, as Gary, as a photojournalist, and others, how do you deal with that when you're talking to people and the different reactions?
Do you mind if this also relates to my thoughts on the first question, which is there are, I would say, plenty of vestiges and what we see as structural inequalities, both in institutions as well as in world politics, that result in these deep-seated feelings, or at the very least, feelings of discomfort at a lack of justice being done. And I felt the same way when I was looking into the Stockage case. It was another ICTY case wherein everyone was asking, why was genocide not proven? And at the end of the day, it came down to numbers. It came down to almost, or fairly much, a mathematical equation. So how many people does it take? And I'm oversimplifying things, of course, but this again brings me to my point of, again, challenging everyone I meet, even those in the grocery store, to think about justice outside of the courtroom, because I do think that we tend to, again, as a vestige of history and the colonialism that has pervaded history, that has helped us, that has set up the institutions we are now working with, is seen as a formalization, as the only valid thing, the only valid way of getting justice. And I think of justice, again, as much of being telling the truth, getting it out there without permission from any court, without the backing of academic institutions. There's so much power in that, and there have been movements to delegitimize it. So again, even this question of what is legitimate, what is important enough to serve for justice, I would say, again, I would urge everyone to think of as so much of it being able to happen before and well after courtrooms, or even if courtrooms ever act.
Hi. So my question is on the broader dimension of the documentation of violence, because I'm thinking today there is a huge discourse on how perhaps desensitized the public is, or how there is an excessive coverage of violence in the public space of media. And so I was just wondering, in your eyes, do you believe that there's a certain sanctity to be maintained, a respect, so to speak, for victims? Or are there any ethical limits of putting up violence into the public space? Or if we're thinking about the documentation and how it can be used in courts, do you believe that, you know, the public needs to be shown the violence and needs to know what is happening in the world? And so I guess what I'm asking is, where do we draw the line between the documentation, exposure, and perhaps over informality of perhaps social media documentation, especially?
This is a good question. I think the public needs to know what is being done in its name. So if your country invades another country uninvited, and your taxpayers' money is being used to murder civilians and your own soldiers are being killed, I think, you know, you need to be confronted with that. But also there are ways to represent war crimes, violence, and not do it egregiously. And I think the challenge for a practitioner is to find ways to do that, to do it respectfully, to do it, to allow everybody some dignity. But I don't think we shouldn't be photographing these things. I think these things need to be photographed. And very often, we were discussing this a little earlier, I would photograph things that I wasn't sure whether they should be published, whether they could be published, but I would photograph them because I felt I needed to at the time. And then I would engage in a conversation with others, might be war crimes investigators. In the case of Kosovo, it might be my editors, and discuss the merits of publishing the work or not. And there are photographs that I have made that I have never and would never publish, but I did make them.
I think it's an incredibly important question you asked, because I do feel you can be conditioned. When I used to serve as an ambassador at the UN, and we were reviewing the Caesar report on torture victims in Syria, you could see it happening to yourself. You know, the first time you see a face with eyes gouged out, you don't forget it. And then you see again and again, and you see what happens to these victims. It's sort of like being a first-year medical student. You know, you might retch the first time you cut into a cadaver, but then within a week, you're already used to it. And the same happens if you're overexposed. And I think as a society, we are becoming overexposed. And sometimes you see some crazy things like, you know, when Will Smith struck Chris Rock at the Oscars, and Hollywood was shocked. And you think, but most of Hollywood's output is violence in the form of entertainment. Why should it be shocked? I mean, why should it be like that? And so I do wonder whether, and the question you're raising is critical, whether the threshold, the shock threshold now is so high that you know, you have to go to extremes. But then visual imagery can be extremely powerful without it sometimes, like the body of that little boy, Ilan al-Kurdi, on the beach, and with his little shoes and the way he was aligned. And I mean, it was a very powerful image. It clearly moved, you know, Chancellor Merkel in Germany to open up this sort of possibility for much larger numbers of refugees going. So maybe it's not the shock value, but there's something about the image that strikes us deep. And that's I think, perhaps what we need to be striking at. But the conditioning, I think it's a great question that you asked. Thank you.
I'd like just to follow up. I think one of the shocking things for me when I embarked on my career as a photographer was when I started photographing incidents or situations that I felt uncomfortable with. So photographing soldiers who had just been killed around their colleagues, or going to a funeral, and photographing a family grieving. And what has really surprised me in my career is the extent to which people have articulated, the people I'm photographing have expressed that they want their experience validated, and they want the lives of the people who, you know, lived and who you're photographing, perhaps dead, validated. And so, you know, that for me was really, I'm not sure that I would want somebody photographing a funeral I was attending for my parents, but that's happened to me on numerous occasions. So often when we're looking at photographs, we shouldn't assume that the person who's being photographed is in some way being violated. Very often the photograph has real meaning for them.
I promise I'll be short. And again, because this is, I agree, such an important question, and I would add to it, which imagery specifically have we become desensitized to? Because we can't have this discussion without understanding the difference in reactions to Black and brown bodies being shown terrorized and mutilated on screen versus those of white bodies. And it's also very much related to not only, so Gary very amazingly spoke on the human element in this, and as journalists, what decisions go into this. But we also have algorithms that are now making content moderation decisions for us as to what gets taken down, for example, before it can even reach a single human's eyes with automated content moderation. And as we all know, again, remember that also algorithmic bias is biased in most cases against femme presenting bodies, against Black and brown bodies. And we see this again, I think, as perhaps a part of a media literacy campaign that I would love to see more of, is again, when the technological crosses over into what is necessary for a public to know as consumers of media, and what we need to know in order to question our own beliefs and practices. This is certainly one of them.
So that is essentially what my last question was going to be, tying back to the other questions that we had and some questions that came in from online. But what do each of you, just going down the line very briefly, what do you hope to see change about structures or individuals regarding the use of visuals in documenting abuses? And what can people who are in the audience who want to get involved in this kind of work as lay people professionally do? And just to highlight some of the things that were raised online that we didn't get to, either in curriculum development in schools, teaching about media literacy, or about addressing deep fakes and videos that are curated to mislead, or about using one's own telephone camera, smartphone camera. So just briefly, each of you, if you could sort of wish list item about what might change and how people might get involved. Yeah, I'll start with
So
you, Delina.
There's been lots of debate back and forth. Are we in a post-digital world, right? Are we in a post-truth world? And I would say, as I have not yet gotten to know the personalities of the babies being born right now, in terms of who is alive today and who is engaging with visuals and evidence in media today, I'm going to sound like a broken record. It starts with the public, and I want to emphasize that we do not need formal training to understand these concepts and to practice it. So what I would say is a lot of times people ask me like, oh, can you point me to a center that does this kind of training? And I tell them, it's your couch and your cell phone and your TV. And I'm not being facetious here, because practicing only, I would say the biggest hurdle to practicing media literacy and learning from it is the awareness that you are interrogating yourself in that moment. So, and I am on TikTok. I consume mass media, of course. But I will say there are times when I say, let me put on, it's like Blue's Clues or something. Let's put on our media literacy hats. I would say that's where it can start. And sometimes that's what it can take to make a massive change.
So speaking from inside the media, I think the media needs to interrogate itself to a much greater extent. I think we need to earn the trust of the people we're communicating to. And I think there has to be a much bigger space for publicly owned media, which is quite common in Europe, less common here. But I think the profit in the media is part of the problem. Commercializing the media is part of the problem. So in addition to media literacy, et cetera, I think we, the media, need to examine ourselves, and I think we need new models. And public media, for me, would be the place to start.
So the former UN commander of peacekeeping forces in Rwanda at the time of the genocide against Tutsis and moderate Hutus once said that he was so convinced that if he walked into the UN Security Council with a wheelbarrow filled with bodies and tipped the bodies onto the floor of the Security Council, they would still not do anything. And in part, that's also the other side of it. It's to go back to your point, sir, it's to, if the evidence is being, certainly the visual evidence can be incorporated into a broader remit of evidence submitted, that it prompts then societies to do the right thing, right? Not just to mount prosecutions and win convictions, but for societies to learn and for societies to change. And I think that's the second part that really needs to work as well. That, we like to believe, and it's completely, I shouldn't say this, that if you put, incontrovertible data in front of political leaders, policymakers, that they change. They don't. Market forces change. Those who have a commercial or pecuniary interest may change. But not all policymakers change simply because the evidence is absolutely clear. And that has to be somehow resolved. And it requires, going back to the points that were raised, greater media literacy, greater public awareness of what's happening, and then a desire not to remain quiet about these things.
Thank you all. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our audience. I'm going to hand it back to Tom for a few announcements.
So let's thank everyone for a great discussion before we close out. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to pitch a few more programs we have between now and the end of the semester. Tomorrow, Tuesday, April 18th, join us for our next World Today on stopping the next pandemic, the role of animals in disease transmission. That'll feature Dean Andy Hoffman of the Vet School, Professor Louise Monclo of the Vet School, moderated by Ben Mueller from the New York Times. Then next week on Monday, April 24th at 4:30, we'll have our final Prairie World House Andrea Mitchell Center lecture series on democracy and emergent technology, featuring the Estonian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Prick, moderated by Maya Otarashvili of FPRI. As always, you can access our recordings of these events on YouTube. Please follow us on social media, and in the student lounge, we have lunch for anyone who would like it. So before we all get up, please join me in another round of applause for our speakers.